life so full of stuff, it is easy to feel like you are not doing enough as an individual to save the rest of this dying world. This feeling has often led me to apathy, to distancing myself from the horrors of the world in order to cope with my inability to help. But I can't help but feel like this is all just a simple lie when I tell myself to keep from breaking down. But what right do I have to give up to break down in the face of genocide when I'm not the one that is suffering? How weak must I be to protect my ignorance, protect my comfort with the army of my heart, instead of using that infantry of my love to lead a collective war on an individual level? There are those out there that keep saying the situation is complicated, you don't know the specifics of the history, or you don't understand, as an attempt to discredit the many voices of support that Palestine is receiving. But I'm done not understanding. No matter how much I support Palestine in my heart, without some type of action, my love for them feels flimsy, see-through, weightless. So we do what we can thousands of miles away. We share posts, we share books. Some even get out there and brick by brick dismantle the establishment before us. I aim to be even half as brave as these people. The indigenous people out there that blocked the boats in Tacoma, the dock workers in Barcelona that refused to work at the behest of Israel, the people out in Scotland breaking the equipment used to make their weapons, the Holocaust survivors and relatives of survivors out there in the streets reliving their own familial horrors to stop them from being enacted on anyone else. The Palestinians in the streets carrying their beloved relatives and pets in their arms, dancing in the rain and refusing to leave behind the sick and weak in their hospitals. The sentiment in which we are not freeing Palestine, they are freeing us, rings true in so many ways. And still, Palestine deserved more from us. I have a poem here by M. Barry called Because of Us. This morning, I learned the English word gauze, finely woven medical cloth, comes from the Arabic word Gaza, because Gazans have been skilled weavers for centuries. I wondered then how many of our wounds have been dressed because of them, and how many of theirs have been left open because of us. So I am taking the first step. That's all this truly is just the first step. There will be more work to be done. Even after all of this work here, I am not free until all of us are free, and I'm sorry to say it, but neither are you. So I am here to simply prepare for what's next, prepare to continue to fight for those who are oppressed, to lift up the voices of those who are quieted. I take one step in a journey of a million steps. I have collected a reading list here, compiled of many different things in a personal attempt to share the lives of Palestine with you as much as I can. As the overreader that I am, I originally picked up 6 books, but here for you in this video I just have 3, as I think that they deserved the time and the attention. I have a non-fiction historical book written by a Palestinian, 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. I also have quite the interesting read here by an Israeli woman called Tracing Homelands, trying to gain a wider perspective of Israel. And then both of those are followed up by a thoughtful political analysis of the United States' involvement in the Palestine-Israel situation called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. So I hope that you will join me in taking my first step. I hope you will take your first step with me and keep me company as we move forward in learning, as we move forward in what's right, as we stand for those who cannot stand for themselves in the most minuscule ways. And I hope that you'll take this information and you will decide to do something for yourself. Because if we want a better world, we can't look away anymore. Okay, 4th page in. This is a quote from the founder of Zionism, the man who created the origin of the concept. "We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it employment in our own countries. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." And I just don't know if you can get any clearer than that. Hitler is to Nazism as this Herzl guy is to Zionism, basically. He said this in 1895, and wouldn't you know it, Zionism began in Germany. Man, I'm blown away. So the very first piece of history that we get here, back in the 1890s, Rashid Khalidi, the author's great uncle, who was a mayor of Jerusalem, had many seats of power, was well educated and well traveled, wrote a letter to the creator of Zionism as basically an appeal, saying, while it would be great for Jewish people to have their own homeland, people already live here. And in the reply that the founder of Zionism gave, he disregarded that people already lived there, basically said that Jewish immigration would benefit the people of Palestine, and a very common colonizer concept in that they were benefiting the people that they are colonizing. Mostly, to me, it is so crazy that all of these horrible things can be tracked down to an exact moment in time, almost. A true beginning of a long and horrible journey for so many people. To think about how the minor actions, preaching beliefs of these people became what they are today. And not only that you can track it down to an exact moment, but that we have the ancestor of the man who began the Palestinian struggle here and speaking to us. It's so crazy how valuable these voices are. Damn, I'm only 4 pages in. Okay, but why, when the Ottoman Empire was destroyed by mostly Great Britain then basically took over power of the entire Middle East and granted everybody independence except for India, Egypt, and Palestine. It's just frustrating to see how historically impactful Great Britain made itself be, and the probably millions of people, because it's generation after generation after generation that have been affected by their colonial attitudes and policies in some way, shape, or form, everywhere, basically. So basically, Great Britain destroys the Ottoman Empire and basically breaks it up into a bunch of different countries. It also stepped in and said, we are establishing a Zionist state. The military backing of Great Britain was what allowed Zionists to move in to Palestine, basically. Was the main thing. And then once the Jewish people got into Palestine, they created their own economy that Palestinians were excluded from. And so any benefits that anybody may have reaped from a larger population, more imports or whatever, Palestinians were not able to reap those rewards because the Zionist community's economy was closed off to them and completely separate. And that allowed Zionists to both gain international prowess, because they were the ones that were coordinating externally and economically, and 2, allowed other countries to support the Zionist movement without also importing money into the Palestinian community at the same time. It basically shut off any resources that may have been shared, which was a big reason that the gap between what Israel became and what Palestine stayed as, just grew and grew and grew exponentially. And not only were they financially segregated, once Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, he made an agreement with Zionists to remove Jewish people from Germany. And in this agreement, he allowed the Jewish people to take up to $100 million in assets. So
even in this time of war, there was an influx of money coming into the Zionist community that was completely inaccessible to anybody to anybody from Palestine. It's so crazy to see how much the financial weighting of everything that they did played out so heavily into the disparity between the two groups of people. Stupid. I'm still only like 40 pages into this book, but like the arguments that he talks about, like the original Zionists, beginners of the movement back at the beginning of the 1900s, like they are the exact same arguments that Israeli people use to justify their actions today. It's so messed up. It's so messed up, man. We have just reached a part in which 6 Arab states form the Arab League. Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan. And purposefully left out Palestine because those countries could not continue to have British support of their independence if they supported Palestine because of how much Britain discouraged Palestinian independence. And this was after the people of Israel, the Zionists in Palestine, had already dropped Great Britain as their supporter and had already appealed to the United States. They left behind Britain because Britain was a falling colonial power, and as the United States rose to power after World War II, literally just jumped from one colonial power to the other and followed the United States on its rise to power. Snakes, man, those snakes. But Palestine has been alone in this, and it's so sad to see it, because Rashid Khalidi talks so much about how progressively all countries in the Middle East fought and gained and gathered for their independence. So much so that they stopped caring about the freedom of Palestine itself and cared more about their own personal independence as a country. At every turn, like, things accelerate negatively for the Palestinians. It's so severely sad.
2 seconds later.
And then, oh my god, ruling of the United States to send all of the Jewish refugees from World War II to Palestine is like the beginning of the United States sticking its entire torso into the Middle East's business. It was basically the thing that set the precedent for U.S. interference in the Middle East. It's so crazy to think about this location being the crux of so much history, so much humanity. Like, because of Palestine, the United States was allowed to step into the Middle East, and we obviously saw how that all turned out. I've reached the Nakba. Basically, when Israel stopped caring about what Britain had to say, because Britain stopped caring about what Israel had to say, and because Israel continued to refuse to work with Great Britain, the Great Britain government handed the whole Palestine-Israel partition issue to the United Nations. The United Nations agreed in the partition. They agreed to give 56% of Palestine over to the Jewish immigrants in the following months, as British forces withdrew because of the negative fight back from Israel. This was the Nakba. Large urban areas of the Arab state were bombed, were harassed by snipers, even before Israel had declared themselves a state in May. 113,000 people were displaced. And nobody cared. Israel literally just displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and nobody cared. Palestine was literally left completely alone, as most of their urban population became refugees and lost their homes and livelihoods. It sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? I just want to come to a paragraph here. Maybe that it really personalizes the effect that the Nakba had. Among those displaced in 1948 were my grandparents, who had to leave their home where my father and most of his siblings were born. Initially, my grandfather, now 85 years old and frail, stubbornly refused to leave his home. After his sons took most of the family to shelter in Jerusalem and Nablus, he remained there alone for several weeks. Fearing for his safety, a family friend from Haifa ventured to the house during a lull in the fighting to retrieve him. He left unwillingly, lamenting that he could not take his books. Neither he nor his children ever saw their home again. The ruins of my grandparents' large stone house still stand abandoned on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Rashid Khalidi's personal moments that he has added add so much dimension to the story. One, because they're primary sources. They're sources of people who lived through those events, of people who were there. But two, this book feels like not only an attempt to save the history of Palestine, but an attempt to save the history of his family. And it is beautiful and it is heartbreaking at the very same time, because in the beginning of the book, as he told me about his family, I knew destruction was inevitable. And it was really sad to look at it like that. This is a fight that Rashid Khalidi's family has been fighting since the very beginning. He keeps talking about how none of what Israel has done would have been possible without the use of force. All of Israel's aims and claims and attempts to do basically anything would, without a doubt, require force in order to enable them. And that was always the plan, was to use force to remove Palestinians from the land. 700,000 people displaced in the Nakba. And that doesn't include any of the people that were killed. It's sad and it's hard. I think it's hard to ponder so much length of time, that's outside of your own sphere. There's just like some inevitable type of disconnect there. But reading this and being able to see the facts of the situation laid out in front of me, the exact events, the exact words that people said, it really grounds everything that's going on right now in reality, making it, to me, the idea of Israel feel less unconquerable. I feel like Israel has so much power, and even throughout this book he talks about why Israel has so much power and how they have so much power and how they continue to have so much power. And his speaking of it really makes it less of a daunting subject. The full history, the full context, like people saying, things are so complicated. Like the natural conclusions that you come to when faced with the facts of the history, devalues Israel in itself. It allows you to see it for what it truly is, and in a way take strength that Israel may be defeated, that Palestine may be given their lands back. It's sad. These historical events are so deeply sad, but in reading them and learning about them and processing them, Israel does not feel any longer like the unconquerable force that it has for the past month and a half. For myself, obviously, reading this has really emboldened me not only to have strength in the ideas, but to have strength in our ability to fight against them. Israel is just a country that manipulated a lot of other countries into giving them a lot of money, and then looking the other way when they began harming people. Historical analysis in here is so supremely well done. The history has truly been looked over and over and over again to find cause and effect, streams of consciousness, and talking for 8 minutes already. I need to stop talking. is a lot going on here. A lot of unstable Middle Eastern countries being continually manipulated because of the destabilization that they were submitted to when they didn't have their own independence. And all of that culminated in Palestine taking the bullet for everybody. After the Nakba, Israel attacked Egypt, took over the Gaza Strip, because originally the Gaza Strip was a part of Egypt. The UN declared a ceasefire 4 separate times, and none of those 4 times did Israel actually cease fire. The final time, the UN created the Security Council Resolution 242. This resolution became the way that we, like the playbook for how we currently deal with Middle Eastern situations. And it doesn't mention Palestine at all. It doesn't mention the Palestinians. There's not a single mention of Palestine. So what this resolution did is it took this Israel versus Palestine conflict and turned it into an Israel versus the countries around it, completely erasing Palestine as an entity, as a group of people. And this was all thanks to the US. This allowed Israel to basically divide and conquer everybody. Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan. Everybody was scared of Israel. Is scared of Israel because of the military force that they were given by Great Britain. Oh man, okay, this is after the Third War. This is after Israel has attacked Egypt and taken possession of the Gaza Strip in West Jerusalem, the West Bank. In Beirut, on the other hand, where I now spent the summers with my mothers and brothers, I was witness to an important resurgence of Palestinian political agency. Writers and poets, both through the Palestinian diaspora and living inside Palestine, together with other gifted and engaged artists and intellectuals, played a vital role in the Renaissance, culturally and politically. Their work helped to reshape a sense of Palestinian identity and purpose that had been tested by the Nakba and the barren years that followed. In novels, short stories, plays, and poetry, they gave voice to a shared national experience of loss, exile, alienation. At the same time, they evinced a stubborn insistence on the continuity of Palestinian identity and steadfastness in the face of daunting odds. I feel like so often people underestimate the impact of books, underestimate the impact of writing, of stories, of poetry, when those types of records, history written down, are the inspiration for things like this, the inspiration for the Palestinian resistance to keep going. So I am personally so excited to take a dive into some of these stories because they are the crux of the Palestinian identity's recovery after 1967. And that is so cool. That is so amazing that not only did those writers create something for their own people, but they created something that I am able to partake in and use for my own benefit. Not only did they spark revolution, these writers, they continue to spark revolution. And there's so much to say about how much writing and reading have an impact on the entire world. But to learn that writing and reading was the savior almost of the Palestinian identity is so beautiful. Especially as I sit here with a stack of Palestinian books. I have their legacy here before me. And I'm so grateful to still have their legacy here before me. I'm feeling so many emotions. Reading this, I just admire the Palestinian identity so much because it is truly as human as you can get. They announced that they recently surpassed the number of people that died in the Nakba in 1948. I think that in and of itself is part of our duty, and to make sure that as the Palestinian people recover, if they are ever able to, we continue to uphold their history, uphold their identity, uphold their existence, so that their erasure doesn't happen again like it did back in 1948 and previously. It's going to rely on the people of the world to continue to fight for Palestinian voices even when the fighting is over, because that's just the beginning of the fight. In all honesty, that is the beginning of the next battle, is to continue to fight for the Palestinian people after the bombing and war is over, because they will still need advocation. They will still need people to believe them in their stories, in their experiences. Okay, excuse my dryer. This book is basically split into the 6 wars that Palestine has experienced over between 1917 and 2017. So the first one was when the Ottoman Empire fell apart, and then Britain said that Jewish people can have Palestine. The second war was the Nakba, in which they went in and basically did what they're doing to Palestine now, bombed civilian areas, killed a lot of people, went against ceasefire demands continually. Throughout all of this, the Palestine Liberation Organization was created. So then the third war, it was when Israel invaded Egypt in order to suppress the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Then the fourth war was when Israel invaded Lebanon in order to crush the PLO. So basically, Israel went to war with Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan just to crush, the Palestinian people that had been forced to move to those areas because of the Nakba. And they did this with the support of the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia and the U.S. were basically working together to destabilize the whole Middle East in the background. And eventually, the end of the third war happened because Egypt abandoned Palestine and signed a peace treaty with Israel. And the U.S. helped influence this because the U.S. wanted to take Egypt away from being partnered with the USSR. So the third and the fourth war in particular are very politically heavy because they involve more than just Israel and Palestine, as the whole situation always has. But basically, these wars were established the problem as a problem between Israel and Arab countries, basically erasing Palestine. And the difference between when Israel invaded Egypt and when Israel invaded Lebanon. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, they had the backing of the U.S. The U.S. was fully aware of all of the plans that Israel had, all of the very brutal plans. They killed, I think what he said was the rate was about 1,500 people, 1,500 civilians a day that were being killed during the 10-day invasion of Beirut, Lebanon. Just listen to this passage, because Israel literally made the U.S. submit to their policies and procedures. Indeed, the documents show that U.S. officials had difficulty standing up to the Israelis over anything to do with their occupation of West Beirut. When Moshe Aarons, Israel's ambassador in Washington, was obliged to listen to a series of harsh talking points read to him that were drafted by Secretary of State George Shultz, accusing Israel of deception and demanding the immediate withdrawal of its troops from West Beirut, Aarons responded with scorn. "I'm not sure you guys know what you are doing," he told Lawrence Eagleburger, the Deputy Secretary of State, and called the American points a fabrication and completely false. Eagleberger suggested that the State Department might issue a statement calling Israel's occupation of West Beirut contrary to assurances, at which point Aaron's deputy, the 33-year-old Benjamin Netanyahu, weighed in. "I would suggest you delete this," he said. "Otherwise, you give us no choice but to defend our credibility by setting this record straight. We'll end up in a shooting war with each other." After listening to an aside from Netanyahu in Hebrew, Aaron added, "I think that is right." Rarely in history has a junior diplomat of a small country spoken thus to a senior representative of a superpower and been supported in doing so. Oh my fucking god. The U.S. goes around acting like it's this big baddie. Israel got us to, flip over like a fucking dog. Not that, we should be militant and fight and not coordinate with other countries, but, the fact that Israel just said, look the other way, and we said, okay. The Reagan administration, basically, created this foundation of relationship and created, resolutions and promises in the Israeli relationship that really, really, really prevented anybody down, further down the line after the Reagan administration from basically straying from the U.S.'s original promise to validate Israel as a country. Oh my god. After everything with Lebanon, it basically moved the Palestinian resistance from the hands of the people who had been exiled back in the 1940s back into the occupied territories where Palestinians were still living. They basically created a resistance movement called the Intifada, which won public opinion because it was an almost completely unarmed resistance. So basically any pictures, anything like that came out of the occupied territories at that period of time were unarmed Palestinian, mostly young kids, young people being brutalized by Israeli soldiers. And so it really did big damage to Israel's relations with basically every country, even the United States, because of how brutally they were treating these resistance fighters. And that is what the Fifth War was. So after the invasion of Lebanon, there was a Palestinian identity movement within Palestine, within Gaza and the West Bank, which really kicked the ball moving forward for a resurgence of Palestinian identity, of Palestinian spirit, and of Palestinian pride. Think about the personal emotions that Rashid Khalidi definitely has for these experiences, and yet the logical and straightforward assessments that he has of the historical aspects, despite his emotional connection to them. And if anything, it just makes this point even stronger because he builds not only the ethos of it, but he builds the unbreakable foundation of the facts, of the things that happened, horrors that were committed and carried out. His perspective, he's so brilliant. He really is. I have such an admiration for him as a historian and as a writer because he's just done a freaking great job. On the up and up, the PLO fucked it up. So for a really long time, for years and years, the PLO had been the only leading organization for the Palestinian people. But by 1987, the people that were leading the PLO hadn't lived in Palestine for decades, so they were a little out of touch. During the Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, instead of supporting Kuwait like all of the other Arab countries did, they supported Iraq because Iraq was providing money to the PLO. Despite the popular opinion of most Palestinian people to support Kuwait and support, the Arab society and everything, that really, obviously, people in the U.S. were not happy about that. It really ruined and greatly impacted the war became a social war. And I think that's why Israel ended up being so successful, because they saw that early. They saw way early on in the 30s that the United States was going to be the superpower. They leveraged themselves to gain money, to gain relationships, to gain access, to reduce money in Palestine, to reduce access, all of those things. So much so that by the time it was a full-fledged social war, Palestinian leadership did not have the capability to negotiate and to propagandize and to influence like Israel did. Like, shut the fuck up. I'm almost done, and I found this paragraph. There is still the possibility that Israel could attempt to reprise the expulsions of 1948 and 1967 and rid itself of some or all the Palestinians who tenaciously remain in their homeland. Against this horrific regional and global background, which elicits scarce concern internationally, there might seem to be little to restrain Israel from such an action. But the ferocious fight the Palestinians would wage against their removal, the intense international attention to the conflict, and the growing currency of the Palestinian narrative all mitigate against such a prospect. How things change so quickly. Given the clarity of what is involved in ethnic cleansing in a colonial situation, a new wave of expulsions would probably not unfold as smoothly for Israel as in the past. Even if undertaken under cover of a major regional war, such a move would have the potential to cause fatal damage to the West's support for Israel, on which it relies on. I am here to provide some potential hope and solutions. Well, Rashid Khalidi is here to provide some hope and potential solutions. He talks a lot about how a big fundamental of Zionism is the inequality of the people. It's like the basis for all of the policies that they enact and everything. Uprooting the systemic inequality inherent in Zionism is crucial to creating a better future for both peoples. He does this continually in that he is very sympathetic to the people of Israel with no... He shouldn't be, but he is. It's an empathetic approach, a diplomatic approach. Definitely, but it's just not one that you would naturally think. Any formula advanced as a resolution of the conflict will necessarily and inevitably fail if it is not squarely based on the principle of equality. Absolute equality of human, personal, civil, political, and national rights must be enshrined in whatever future scheme is ultimately accepted by the two societies. This is a high-sounding recommendation, but nothing else will address the core of the problem, nor will it be sustainable and lasting. This leaves the thorny issue of how to wean Israelis from their attachment to inequality, which is often coded as and justified by a need for security. This perceived need is to a large extent rooted in a real history of insecurity and persecution, but in response to this past trauma, generations have now been brought up on a reflexive dogma of aggressive nationalism whose tenacious hold will be hard to break. Thus, the Jewish citizens of a regional superpower that cows its neighbors suffer from a deep insecurity rooted in part in this history, and perhaps in part from an unspoken concern that the carefully constructed and justified colonial reality they might live in might suddenly unravel. Okay. Here is something anybody can do. As the weaker party in the conflict, the Palestinian side cannot afford to remain divided. But before unity can be achieved, a redefinition of objectives must take place on the basis of a new national consensus. It is a searing indictment of both Fatah and Hamas that in recent decades, civil society initiatives such as the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and student activism have done more to further the Palestine cause than anything either of these two main factions has undertaken. So that is Rashid Khalidi basically admitting how important those things like boycotting and student demonstrations and things have been Palestinian cause, because the young people have always been the biggest supporters of Palestine. Completed. Literally the most tabs I've ever used in a book. Amazing. It's a love letter to the suffering of his people that he has experienced. And not only that, it's a love letter almost to all of the oppressed populations of the world. The universality of it, the fact that in the very end, he does a great job. He explains how Israel is attempting to commit a colonial act in a post-colonial time. In a time when colonialism is not so innate into the political fabric of the world, and that's why Palestine has been able to resist and survive for over 100 years of war, because the world is beyond accepting and just ignoring those types of actions that Israel is committing. This is amazing. If you're looking for historical context from a Palestinian perspective, this is great. I'm about to dive into Tracing Homelands, the one from the Israeli woman's perspective, and her perspective of learning about what Israel really did to Palestinians and things like that. This is a very direct, because it's, history, historical facts, historical dates, evidence, all of those things. By Linda Dittmar. Ooh, all right. Linda Dittmar comes out swinging. Let's introduce you to her. Speeding on Israel's paved roads, one rarely notices signs of the Nakba, even when some ruin or abandoned tomb or a mosque comes into view, especially in built-up areas. They've been absorbed into Israel's evolving vernacular and ornamental architecture in ways that disguise what they are, let alone what they used to be. Does it matter that a lone fig tree happens to stand near a pile of stones in an empty field? Or that a lovely restaurant had once been a mosque? Or that a grocery in a small Israeli village built of beautifully chiseled stones used to be a Palestinian 2-room schoolhouse? Once you know enough to notice this grafting of the new on the old, Israel no longer looks the same. It did not come easily to me, this new way of looking that had me also question Israel's dearly held myths of origin. Yet between 2005 and 2008, that is what I did. Searching the land with my photographer partner, Deborah, aiming to record whatever evidence of the Nakba we could still find. It's a lot more anecdotal, it's because it's about more so her personal experiences, and she does provide the little historical snippet or context. It's so interesting because it's a very completely different perspective. Undoing of her own thoughts and processes, which I think is really important because everybody has their own faults. Like, we live in a society. We live in a society that creates prejudices and judgments and all of these rules and restrictions within our own heads. And so seeing the process of somebody, especially somebody who lives under the heavily propagandized rule of Israel, break through those things consistently is quite important and inspiring. She talks continuously about how long it took her because she had to fundamentally undo every tiny teaching that she was given as she grew up and began to understand the world, and learned that her understanding of it was completely wrong. Just talked about how Israel and the Jewish National Fund plants trees everywhere, all throughout Israel. And the propaganda that they give for that is that they love the trees and that they want the trees, that they are healing their land and they are bringing life back to their land, when in reality, a lot of what they're doing is simply putting tree cover over the remnants of the Palestinian towns and villages that used to be there. Very different from the perspective that I just read. Very, very different. I'd like to direct you to this post by Hella Alian, but their words really spoke to me, especially with how succinct they were. This post specifically about how we owe Gaza endurance, but more specifically about how bearing witness is an honor. And as I read these books and I bear witness, I feel that honor. Every word, every person that was able to get part of their story down, it is an honor. And I had never thought of it. I had never recognized that it was honor that I was feeling, that it was pride that I was feeling for being able to read these experiences. But I just wanted to leave those words here because I think that I'm going to carry them with me. Bearing witness is an honor, especially in the face of erasure, death, genocide, blackout. That is our duty. So, I promise I will keep bearing witness. I will not look away. I think this paragraph is quite important. Searching for traces of the Nakba, I began to see my own history in new ways. It was no longer just a question of mapping locations or trying to tell rock from rubble. It meant mulling over causes and effects and reading about this history, including the early Yeshiv's memoirs and reflections gathered in Mordecai Elvai's The First Aliyah and David Yari's Memories of Eretz Israel, 2 volumes each. What used to be a jumble of cliches learned at school and hazy memories clamoring for attention began to take shape, leading me to question the national narrative that had inspired me for so many years. And I think that's important. I actually think that the story that she's telling is very important because I think, as like an abolitionist, which I'm a big believer in, like their approach, their understanding of the Palestinian people, the racism, the xenophobia, the colonization, and how to undo all of that teaching so that you're no longer complicit. I think it is important to think about making sure that you're giving everybody the opportunity to free themselves, and if they don't take that opportunity, then that in and of itself is the indication of their character, of their action and their beliefs and things. And so I think that this Linda Dittmar is telling a very important story because she's really opening a door and giving people an opportunity to learn or even begin thinking about undoing the own propaganda that has been put upon us. Even in not like in an Israel context, like the way that she reconsiders many of the things that she grew up with as a child and reevaluates them. I think that's a very important perspective to be told because it's what a lot of people in, the United States, Britain, a lot of countries in Europe should be doing right now. It's part of the work. She's not even necessarily trying that hard. She's just talking about her personal experiences, but it's because she's done the work to depropagandize her own brain and really do as much as she possibly can to make an impact after she has done that. So, the power that people have when they can free themselves is very cool. She talks about how they start their military programs at like 13 or 14, like, or at least they did back in the 50s when she grew up. That's so young. Like, they always trained with weapons, crawling, hurling grenades, like, trained and did all of these things at 14.
That's the militarization of that is so, like, that scale is so massive. That's so crazy. Just have a little bit left, but I think that I'm gonna read you a paragraph because I think it's a really good summary of a lot of the things that Linda Dittmar has talked about. Amos's refusal to know the past belongs to all of us Israelis. My silence when Deborah and I visited Grandma's home was first about a loss that occurs in the course of ordinary life. A grandmother dies, a house loses its tenants. But by 2008, my silence was also inseparable from other silences. It's safer to remain, I thought, to refuse to talk, to be afraid to talk, to not know how to talk, or to forget to talk, even when inwardly we scream. There are the thoughts and explanations my parents withheld from me, the learning that did not happen at school, the comments I did not hear in the streets, the facts omitted by the press and hourly broadcasts, the muteness of soldiers returning from combat, and the life stories not told by our immigrants and by the Palestinians whom we prefer not to hear. And then there was my own muteness. In this noisy, voluble, opinionated, and contentious country, some things remain unspoken. I do think that this is really good. I think it's a great jumping off point because that's all that it really can be. I finished Tracing Homeland. It was pretty good. I do think that the story is important, and I think it's a great first step to decolonization, but it's not everything that it could be. It just still has a little bit of the privilege that a colonizer enjoys. Pretty good. Definitely not as good as 100 Years War on Palestine. I just think that Rashid Khalidi is a genius. The last book that I'm going to be reading is Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick. What I was kind of going for, this is like the political side of it. I think the 100 Years War was obviously very politically heavy because what's happening to Palestine right now is political, but it's very much so centered on the events that happened and the effects that they had and the people that were there. So I'm looking for something that's a little more centered on like the politics of the situation. Except for Palestine argues that progressives and liberals who oppose regressive policies on immigration, racial justice, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and other issues must extend these core principles to the oppression of Palestinians. In doing so, authors Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick take seriously the political concerns and well-being of both Israelis and Palestinians, demonstrating the extent to which the U.S. policy has made peace harder to attain. Totally believe that. So this is like the political focus. And it's only so this is deceiving because half of this is the index, the notes on it. Last one. Strong opener. We recognize that the effects of Trump's reign will not magically disappear in the wake of the 2020 election. We also understand that President Biden is incapable, and in some cases unwilling, to repair the damage wielded by the previous administration. With such reduced expectations, we have little reason to believe that the Biden presidency will properly attend to the systemic issues that preceded and indeed helped produce the Trump phenomenon. This analysis applies not only to domestic matters, but also to U.S. foreign policy. They said it, not me. They talk here about how, because of how much the United States has influenced the imbalance of power between Israel and Palestinians. There's no other way to resolve it other than with the US included. And it like that makes a lot of sense, but also that sucks because the US sucks. And as we have seen, including the US is not always the best thing at times. And so they say it's up to us as Americans to ensure that our involvement is based on universal humanistic values that are applied in a consistent manner. Such an approach has not historically been part of US policy. As we enter the Biden era, we must change direction. We must no longer render Palestine exceptional. They say an interesting thing here. It talks about how it took a really long time, like decades and decades, and the entire Holocaust, in order for there to be like a clear Jewish support for Zionism as a concept. And then he says, while Jews, like any other large collective, are entitled to define their own existence, they are not entitled to unilaterally decide how that identification might affect others, which is a really good way to say that. Like any other people, Jews can and have used their collective memory and shared culture to forge a nation, and that is a Jewish prerogative. But the land that is being contested is not uniquely the homeland of the Jews. While Jews' right to decide the definition of their own collective existence is axiomatic, their right to displace another people to lay claim to a historic homeland from many centuries past is not. That's a great line. Okay, so this is interesting. This is in 2018, so literally 1 year after where Rashid Khalidi ends his book. Nation state law was finally approved in 2018, right? And what it established is the land of Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people, state of Israel has the right to exist, blah, blah, blah. And that the exercise of the right to national self-determine in the state of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people. So they essentially, in 2018, made discrimination, prejudice, inequality part of their constitution. Fundamentally, part of the law processes that they have is because like there are still Palestinians in Israel, there are still non-Jewish people in Israel, and with the passing of that law, they lost so much freedom, so much independence, and that's 2018, 5 years ago. I feel dumb, but now I'm smarter, so it's okay. Because, like, I didn't realize that, like, BDS, like, the boycotting of things from Israel, is and has been a movement for the past, like, over 20 years. I thought it was just like, power to the people. There's a problem, you start boycotting. But it's like an actual movement that has been like discussed politically, has faced oppression by the United States government in the past before. Like the movement basically is the boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel's product. And it's like just a movement. It's a call to action basically that has been around since, the beginning of the 21st century as a form of nonviolent protest that the Palestinians wanted to inspire. And so, like, I didn't realize that the boycott that is now thankfully gaining so much traction, against McDonald's and Starbucks and things, like it has a history, and it took so long for the people that have led this movement to get to where we are now. It's absolutely insane to think about, and I didn't know that at all. I didn't know that at all. But like even before the BDS movement, like even back into the 80s, like Palestine was using boycotting as a way to disrupt Israel's systematic flow, and that's really cool to think about. Makes the boycott feel very real because it was something that Palestinians themselves started. That's crazy. I didn't know that. I have been learning about Palestine for like 3 months now, and I didn't know that, so that's really cool. Oh, this book is getting a little emotional on us. It's Palestinian nonviolence is not merely about mass protests or grand gestures. Rather, it is taken up
in the practices of everyday life. Palestinian American activist Yusuf Munayyer wrote, "The truth is that there is a long, rich history of nonviolent Palestinian resistance dating back well before 1948, when the State of Israel was established atop a depopulated Palestine. It has just never captured the world's attention the way violent acts have. We tend to think of nonviolent resistance as an active rather than passive concept. In reality, even though the majority of the native inhabitants were depopulated during the Nakba, thousands of Palestinians practiced nonviolent resistance by refusing to leave their homes when threatened. Today, through its occupation, Israel continues to make life unbearable for Palestinians, but millions resist the pressure by not leaving. This is particularly notable in occupied Jerusalem, where Palestinians are being pushed out of the city. For those who have never lived in a system of violence like the Israeli occupation, it is hard to understand how simply not going anywhere constitutes resistance. But when the objective of your oppressor is to get you to leave your land, staying put is part of the daily struggle. In this sense, every Palestinian living under the Israeli occupation is a nonviolent resistor." Wow, that's a lovely passage. They talk really nicely here about how BDS and the oppression of BDS invalidation of the First Amendment, and yet despite that, a lot of regulations, restrictions have come about against BDS. Basically, they used, like, that the whole chapter was about criminalizing BDS, because that has been ultimately the first thing that anybody that hears about Palestine can do to support it, like, very much is a show of, like, the power of the people, and how, like, innately that means that they can't take that away from us because it's in regards to political and social issues. It's protected by the First Amendment here. The fact that they use the exception of Palestine to subvert that's their foot in the door to do that in other situations, in other scenarios, in other cases, to continue to overextend their reach of the people. That's crazy. For Palestinians, Americans, and Europeans can support the simple principle of equal rights, a position that will very likely have a real political effect in time. Perhaps that is why BDS evokes such a viscerally defensive response, even for many ostensible progressives. It reminds us all too clearly that the simple support for equal rights, not in the abstract, but as the only route to a political solution in Israel-Palestine, would be easy enough for us as citizens to act upon. While Israel should never be unfairly isolated or targeted, it also cannot be shielded from principles and organized political pressure through boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. These tactics have always been critical tools for producing peace, freedom, and justice for the vulnerable. Palestine cannot be an exception. This is like for a debate. Like, like, this book is not, it's not for your average reader. It's for people that are trying to do research or formulate arguments, like the way that it has, like, an index in the back for the words that it uses. Like, it's made to support an argument, which I think that they do very well at. It just means that the reading density is a little higher than I would like it to be. Basically, the last, like, 30 pages have just been a summary about how a lot of the policies that Trump put into place when he became president were not actually, like, that unusual. They were not a deviation from, like, the usual policies that the United States has had. They were very consistent with them. People want to make a villain of Trump, and they want to say that, like, he's the reason that all of these things have happened, or that certain situations have escalated. But in the Palestine-Israel situation, he's not necessarily the reason why it has escalated. It has been continually escalating ever since, and he only acted in line with U.S. policy. Important part to take away from that is that the policies that the U.S. has had for the United States and Israel and Palestine have been consistently negative for Palestinians, even beyond Trump. It wasn't Trump's fault. Like, it's a systematic pattern and an issue, and that has been passed and carried down. And it's the continual right leaning of our government. If you need to write an essay, pick this up. If you don't need to write an essay, maybe you don't need to. It does a really good job of explaining modern events of Palestine because Rashid Khalidi's book was only up until 2017 and a lot has happened since, obviously. And so it does a really good job at explaining the events that have happened, but it's also like very heavily like it's like dense in its vocabulary and its usage of like sentence structure, and I like wish somebody had taught me this instead of me having to read it from this textbook like book. By scapegoating Hamas, who is certainly more than worthy of intense criticism, we ignore the long history of U.S. involvement in the region by both Democratic and Republican administrations. In doing so, we lose our sense of collective responsibility for the current crisis. Reading, and this is really sad. The Palestinians of Gaza don't just want their freedom, many want their freedom in Gaza, a place that is as much as their homeland as any other part of Palestine. Scholar Helga Twali Suri wrote, Gaza may force us to glimpse into the heart of darkness, but it equally reveals the heart of humanity that never gives up. Gaza is not a footnote. It is the larger-than-life shadow of the colonizer's fear, a people that cannot be quelled. Gaza is larger than life, captivating, awesome, mythical, mesmerizing, extraordinary, impressive, monumental, unreal, burdensome, miraculous, and most of all, durable. Gaza is our obligation. Here we are, and I come to you a changed person, as if you can't tell by the ridiculous tabs. So I think I'm actually going to go backwards from the order that I read them in. So the very last one that I read was Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick. This one was really interesting. I do want to warn you, it is very dense. It is thoroughly researched and dramatically sourced, which is a great thing, but it is very much an academic level of reading. It's not a beginner level of reading on this topic, mostly because of the reading level, not because of the content in the book. This one specifically was about the U.S.'s participation in the Palestine-Israel conflict, the role that they've played over the years, but also specifically in the past few years towards the culmination of everything that has happened now. I really enjoyed learning about the modern events because a lot of the other books that I have read about Palestine have been very much about the history of Palestine. So to get the perspective on what has been happening in the last few years is very invaluable, and I believe it also showed me realistic and modern ideas for a solution. These are solutions that have been put into place recently, that have worked recently, that have benefited the Palestinian population recently, like specifically the BDS movement, which I did not understand before reading this, that was an actual movement that has been around since about 2011 in order to attempt to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. And that movement is what is causing everybody to boycott McDonald's, to boycott Starbucks right now. It is their years and years and years of effort and dedication to the BDS movement that has probably what has allowed us to make such an effect with our own boycott of McDonald's and Starbucks this time around. So learning the history of that movement was really fascinating. Learning the history of the events of the past few years, I think, really was a great way to round off this reading video experience, because it definitely takes all of the things that you have learned about the history and brings them into focus. I just feel like this one is one that was written with a really dramatic sense of urgency, and that urgency comes off very well. It's very well done. It's very well researched. That they've put together a beautiful book here. It's complicated and convoluted because its subject matter is it's politics. It's about the policies the U.S. has enacted, other countries have enacted, the way that Israel has interacted with the countries in the Middle East, things like that. I think if you're out there and you are not a beginner reader on Palestine, you want to take your learning, take your large amount of knowledge,
a step further, I think this would be a really great option for you, because it really does take all of those things a step further into action, into reaction, into like ways of dismantling systems and building better systems and things like that. This book does a really great job at showing how Palestine is the example for the failure of progressive politics. So it can even be used just like in a larger conversation about the failure of progressive politics. Okay, and then before that, I read Tracing Homelands by Linda Dittmar. I thought her descriptive writing was beautiful. Like she just, it wasn't very often, but every so often she would just slot in a descriptive paragraph about the landscape or things, and in her descriptions you can really evoke the conversation of culture, of like land and things like that, because while this woman spent her whole life thinking that this was her homeland, loving and growing to cherish it, in the realization that she came to as an adult, that changed her entire perception of everything. And so she basically had two memories of the land. She had the memory of that she was taught to have, and she had the memory that she realized was the actual truth. And I think that the dichotomy on that is really interesting. The only thing is, I think it's still a beginner decolonization book. It's good to see people trying. It's good to see people attempting to break out of being a colonizer. The thing is, she took over 10 years to do it and was really slow at the progress. And so I think this is very much a beginner step, because she doesn't push it. Like, she takes her time and she meanders and she really, really, really thinks about it. And if we could all have the time to do that, that would be great. But the situation is more dire than it was back in 2012. And so I think it's a good beginning step, because it gives you the places where you need to begin to change your thought processes, but you have to go beyond this. And finally, the absolute ultimate book, and in my opinion, the first book about Palestine that everybody needs to read, 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This man, what a absolute historian. Like, his dedication to the pursuit of history is phenomenal. And in that passion, you see this story come very much alive. And it is a story. He manages to allow the events that have happened to Palestine in the past 100 years to really flow from his fingertips and create the full picture of the matter. This is historical analysis that really helps you understand who has their hands in the cookie jar, how many people of them have their hands in the cookie jar, and how many cookies each of them are trying to steal. He does a great job of pulling so many different pieces together, and not only criticizing Israel, of course, but criticizing the people in Palestine who have chosen power over the safety of their people, because that was a large part of the Palestinian movement, is that a lot of the freedom movement was destabilized by the people in power wanting to keep their safety and their money and their benefits from the Israeli government by separating themselves from the rest of Palestine and allowing the rest of Palestine to receive the treatment that they did. Israel has obviously played a big part in that as well. It has played into this game, poking and prodding these Palestinian movements to continue sowing this discourse. And this is obviously where things like Hamas came from, Fatah came from. The evolution here is mind-blowing to watch. The just rapid escalation and the pure luck that Israel had in making the right political and strategic moves become a different person with the perspective that I have gained from this. It's kind of why I wanted to leave it for last, because I think that this one leaves the most lasting impression in general. Even if you can't remember every single fact or every single little thing like I tried to, it gives you so much important information for you to ponder on, for you to think about who should be in charge of certain things, who deserves the power and where, and how all of the people that think that they know those answers do, and what they have done to hold on to the power that they have claimed. The only downfall about this is that it does only go until 2017. That's the only downfall, but that just means that there is more opportunity for you to learn and for you to read when you finish this one. So go out there, pick this one up, Palestinian history is complex and filled with a barrage of characters serving their own individual intentions, and every Palestinian has suffered because of it. The Israeli persistence is a tale filled with political manipulation, propaganda, authoritarian action, and plain fucking luck. One that has, since the beginning, been built upon the destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians as a people. There are so many ways to discuss this conflict, but in the end there is a very specific conversation that is to be had underneath it all. The morality of this situation is so stark that even Israelis who are willing to see the truth begin their repentance. And yet it has not been enough. Rashid Khalidi predicted this war at the very end of his book with a heartbreakingly scared tone. But there are ways for us to help. Discovering the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest From and Sanction Israel movement, has reinvigorated and re-inspired my commitment to the spreading of the truth to the people around me. Realizing the impact that both armed and unarmed resistance has had on Palestine, and understanding the lengths to which literature has kept the Palestinian alive, I am honored to bear witness to these stories. Although they are filled with so much pain and so much suffering, they hold so much truth as well. We owe it to these people not to look away, to witness with all of our hearts, to listen with all of ourselves. Read these books and read others. Allow your perspective to be changed by a world you have never lived in. Thanks for keeping me company for this. Hope to see you back here again soon. Good night.